Hi again, Risa here, back with another episode of Ask Risa. This is my weekly video series where I answer some common questions about planning your wedding and provide kind of tips and tricks and advice. So you can find other videos in this series on my YouTube channel here. And this is episode 12, so there's quite a few in there now if you are interested in what I've had to say before. So this week, I want to talk about a very common question. I get this question from almost every client I have, and that is how much to tip your wedding vendors. So there's no easy answer to this, as with most things wedding. The answer is very dependent on specific situations. And as with all gratuities and tips, these are discretionary. No one is ever really expecting a tip. They're more common for some vendors than others, but tips are your opportunity to say thank you for a job well done to whoever is providing the service to you. So I'll start with the easy categories. With hair and makeup, it's pretty much the same as what you would tip if you were going to a salon and having your hair or your makeup done. 15 to 20% is standard. So that one's easy. You can budget for that when you're working on your budget in the first place and keep that in mind. If you are paying for hair and makeup services for the other members of your wedding party, then you should also be prepared to cover the gratuities for those services in addition to your own. Delivery people is another easy one. Maybe someone's delivering the flowers or someone's delivering the cake. $5 to $10 cash tip is normal for those type of people. Keep in mind that you are almost certainly not going to be the person who is taking delivery of those items. It's either going to be your wedding planner or your wedding coordinator, or maybe a friend or family member who's at the venue early setting things up. So you just want to make sure you give that person who's taking delivery the cash in advance so that they can pass it on to the delivery person. So then it gets a little bit more complicated. A lot of wedding vendors own their own business and work for themselves. Like I, as a wedding planner, am self-employed. I set my own rates and I own my business. Most photographers, videographers, a lot of DJs, a lot of florists are in the same boat. So with people who own their own business, we're not expecting tips. We set our own rates, so we're charging you what we think is a fair price. But that said, obviously, we love getting a little extra as well. We love a gratuity. We love when our clients feel like we've gone above and beyond what they were expecting and want to give us a little bit extra. No one's ever going to say no to a tip, that's for sure. So if you do feel like one of your vendors has just exceeded your expectations and you'd like to give them something extra, a standard range for that is 10 to 20% of the total bill, or $100 to $250, somewhere in that range. So you can either plan ahead for that, depending on how much interaction you've had with them. Maybe their excellent service started even before the wedding day, and you want to give them something at the end of the wedding. You can have that on hand, or you can send it after the wedding. There's no rule that says you can't give someone something extra after the wedding's already over. Just because the service has ended, you can always Venmo someone a little bit of extra. That would be very much appreciated, I can assure you. If there's a vendor who doesn't own their own company, maybe it's a DJ who works for a larger entertainment company, or it's the second shooter for the photographer, then you can plan ahead to have an envelope cash tip for them, 50 to 150, depending on what your overall budget was and how many hours they were there, and again, the level of service, how well did they do their job, and that's what you're rewarding them for. So those are some guidelines for those areas. And then we get into bartending and catering, which is a little bit more complicated. Some bartenders will put out a tip jar, which I personally am not a fan of. I try to discourage tip jars on the bar because it's expected that your guests are the ones who are contributing to the tip jar. And I find that a little gauche because you are hosting a wedding and you should not be asking your guests to pay for anything. I mean, they've already paid for probably traveling to your wedding and maybe a hotel room and, a dress or a suit or whatever. So asking them to contribute further, I'm not a fan of. So I don't like tip jars. That said, if the bartenders do put out a tip jar, then you are not expected or should not give them any additional tip. They've been covered. They don't need anything else. If they don't put out a tip jar, if you've arranged that ahead of time, then it is standard to tip them, usually $50 to $100 per bartender. And most weddings don't have more than 2 bartenders unless you have a really large guest list. The catering and service staff gets a little bit more complicated. Some of it depends on whether the servers work for the catering company. A lot of full service wedding caterers do have full service staff. And so in that case, you can just calculate 10, 15, 20% of the total catering bill, and you can give that to the catering manager or the person that you've been dealing with throughout the process as either a lump sum of cash or an additional check. You can give that to them even ahead of time or at the wedding to cover the service staff, and they will divvy that up accordingly. If you're doing cash, it's always helpful to have a variety of small bills, some 5s and 10s and 20s, something that's easily divided up among a number of people. If you want to do individual tips and you don't want to do a lump sum, generally for a chef or a carving station or something like that, it's $50 to $100 per person. The banquet captain or catering manager, again, also $50 to $100 in that range. And then individual wait staff, usually $20 to $30 per person. And if you want to know how many gratuities you need ahead of time, you can always reach out to your catering manager and find out how many wait staff they are bringing with them, how many people will be there, so you know how many tip envelopes you need. If the wait staff isn't part of the catering company, like for instance, I've had a couple clients who had restaurants cater their wedding, but the restaurants didn't bring staff, so they had to hire the staff from a staffing service elsewhere, then you definitely want to do the tipping individually. Again, you can give everything to the banquet captain or whomever is overseeing the staff, or your wedding planner or coordinator, and they can make sure those tips are distributed. In that case, it's helpful to have individual envelopes with the amount for each individual person. And one other thing to keep in mind, it's super common for catering companies to charge what is known as a service fee, and that is usually a percentage of the total. So it's usually in the range of 18 to 22% of the total catering bill is the service fee. That is almost never considered a gratuity. That is almost never going to the actual staff. I mean, they're getting paid, obviously. They get paid by the catering company, but they're not getting that service fee as a gratuity. That service fee is sort of an overhead charge, and also just goes toward the running of the business. So don't think of that as a gratuity. A gratuity is separate. Those are the basics. And just in case you weren't taking notes during this, which you probably weren't, I do a written blog post for all of these Ask Risa videos. And so you can find that on my website at risajamesevents.com. There's a link below. And if you go to blog, there's in the header, there's a link for the blog, and it will be the first post if you're watching this video the week it's released. Every week there's a new post out, and so the top post gets replaced, but they're pretty easy to find in the sidebar if you'd like to have this in writing for future reference. So that pretty much does it for tipping. If you have any questions about this or anything else you want me to answer in the future, just leave a comment down below and I would be happy to cover that. And if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you gave it a thumbs up, and you can subscribe if you want to get future videos, notified when there are future videos, which I release every Wednesday. All right, that's all. Thanks. I'll talk to you next week. Bye for now.